My, what a crowd we are becoming. This class of Minno students here at Menopause University just keeps getting more and more numerous. It's like we're reproducing or something. Yep, reproduction. That's our topic for today. But in the context of how your reproductive history affects your risk of epithelial ovarian cancer. If you don't have my book, you need to get it, and get the second edition, which is much more current than the first edition. And in my book, you'll find that this material is in chapter 32 in the section on risk factors. This is video number 427. That means it's the 427th video in this menopause education, which you have to watch in order if you want to actually get the education. And it's the 15th video in the unit on epithelial ovarian cancer. Plus, it's the 7th video on the risk factors for epithelial ovarian cancer. I gave you an overview of all the risk factors in video number 421. So here's the big chart of risk factors that we created back then. Videos 422 and 423 addressed hereditary epithelial ovarian cancer, and all the ones after that have addressed a single category of non-hereditary risk factors. I've added details to the big chart in each of the videos on individual risk factors, but this one doesn't include every single nitty-gritty detail, but it does show you the most important details. For now, I'm keeping it simple for practical reasons. Today, we're ready to tackle the category of your reproductive history as a risk factor for epithelial ovarian cancer. Here it is in the orange hues, starting halfway down the chart. And here it is in isolation. As you look at that list, do you feel like you're having a déjà vu moment in which you've already seen this list? If so, it's because you are watching these videos in order. And this list of reproductive risk factors for epithelial ovarian cancer is just like the one for breast cancer. Here's the big chart of risk factors we created in video number 374 for breast cancer. The reproductive risk factors are in the orange hues on this chart too. You just might realize that I do a lot of planning and organizing for this video education. And in video number 421, on the overview of risk factors for epithelial ovarian cancer, I created this comparison chart between breast cancer and epithelial ovarian cancer so that you could see how they are practically mirror images of one another for the vast majority of risk factors. If you think I'm leaving these big charts on the screen for too short a time, it's because you haven't watched my videos in order. If you have watched them in order, you've seen these charts dozens of times. So if we now create an isolated comparison chart of just these reproductive risk factors, you'll see that they are essentially identical. The only differences are in the nuances of the terminology used to imply the same things. For breast cancer, late age at first full-term pregnancy is specified, whereas for epithelial ovarian cancer, it isn't. Infertility and infertility drugs are specified for epithelial ovarian cancer, whereas for breast cancer, they aren't. But no matter what the terminology, the bottom line is the same for both. And that's what I've placed in the bottom line on this comparison chart. What matters is your menstrual life. In video number 374 of the breast cancer unit, you learned that your menstrual life is an equation for calculating the number of menstrual cycles you've had during your lifetime. It's a very easy calculation as follows. All you do is start with your age at which you became postmenopausal. From your age at postmenopause, you subtract your age at which you had your first period. And then you multiply that number by 13. You multiply by 13 because you actually have 13 menstrual cycles each calendar year, not 12. Then you subtract from that number the number of months you were pregnant, using 10 months for each term pregnancy. Subtract 1 month for each month of prematurity if you had a near-term pregnancy. And then you subtract from that the total number of months you breastfed. And the final answer is your menstrual life. Once you have the number representing your menstrual life, there's a scale for what constitutes low risk, high risk, and very high risk. Now, these parameters are specifically defined for your breast cancer risk only. They are not specified for epithelial ovarian cancer, but they still give you an idea of the typical range. If your menstrual life answer is fewer than 350 menstrual cycles in your lifetime, you have a low risk for breast cancer. If your menstrual life answer is between 350 and 450 menstrual cycles in your lifetime, you have a high risk for breast cancer. If your menstrual life answer is more than 450 menstrual cycles in your lifetime, you have a very high risk for breast cancer. And these parameters tend to be similar for epithelial ovarian cancer. The bottom line is that the more menstrual cycles you have in your lifetime, the higher your risk of epithelial ovarian cancer, regardless of the reasons for your high number of menstrual cycles. And on the contrary, the more similar you are to the old woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children she didn't know what to do, the lower your risk of epithelial ovarian cancer. If we make a chart showing the impact that each risk factor has on the number of menstrual cycles, it looks like this. So younger age at menarche, which is your first period, fewer pregnancies, fewer months of breastfeeding, infertility, use of infertility drugs, and older age at postmenopause all increase your risk. In the breast cancer unit, you learn that having more menstrual cycles increases your risk of breast cancer because your breasts want to do what Mother Nature intended for them to do, which is go through the entire cycle of breast development, including pregnancy and breastfeeding. It's as if your breasts have their own opinion as to how many pregnancies you should have, and they prefer that you have as many as possible. So the more months you spend pregnant or breastfeeding, the lower your risk for breast cancer. Well, guess what? Apparently your ovaries share that opinion. Anything that interferes with Mother Nature's plan for you to be like the old woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children she didn't know what to do tends to increase your risk of both breast cancer and epithelial ovarian cancer. Your ovaries want a break from endless menstrual cycles. I guess you could say that being child-free decreases your chances of being cancer-free, or the kid-free track is the cancer-y track. That's why being like the old woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children she didn't know what to do decreases your risk for epithelial ovarian cancer. This category of reproductive risk factors has been studied a lot, and there is great consistency from one study to another. This absolute association between high numbers of menstrual cycles and increased risk of epithelial ovarian cancer is very sound. However, we have accurate statistics on the degree of increased risk for breast cancer, but we do not have accurate statistics on the degree of increased risk for epithelial ovarian cancer. And that's because of many difficulties in determining the precise degree of increased risk. The first difficulty arises from the fact that epithelial ovarian cancer is such an uncommon disease. The numbers of women with epithelial ovarian cancer are so small that it's difficult to get accurate statistics. A second difficulty arises from the tremendous overlap between hereditary and non-hereditary epithelial ovarian cancers in scientific research. If you can't separate out genetic factors from reproductive factors, the statistics are meaningless. A third third difficulty arises from the inability to separate increased risk of epithelial ovarian cancer based on ethnicity from that based on reproductive history or genetics. Keeps coming up again and again. And the fourth difficulty arises from the tremendous overlap of hereditary epithelial ovarian cancer with non-hereditary risk factors for epithelial ovarian cancer. All in all, one of the biggest problems with statistics for epithelial ovarian cancer comes from this overlap of one category of risk factors with another. As it stands now, we do not even have accurate statistics for how much the category of reproductive history contributes to epithelial ovarian cancers. So while we know it's a significant contributor in terms of why it increases your risk, we don't know the degree to which it increases your risk. The bottom line is that being child-free decreases your chances of being cancer-free. And if you're like the old woman who lived in a shoe and has so many children you don't know what to do, you increase your chances of being cancer-free. But take a look at the very last row of risk factors in the reproductive history category of risk factors. It's HRT with a question mark. Now, this particular risk factor just doesn't fit the mold. And there are some very confusing and confounding reasons as to why it doesn't fit the mold. Thus, the question mark. You know that you can take HRT in a continuous regimen in which you do not have cycles. And in that case, you would not be increasing the number of menstrual cycles you have in your lifetime or increasing your menstrual life value. This is true even if you take HRT for the rest of your life. So why is HRT a questionable risk factor on this list? Could it be that taking HRT in a cyclic regimen makes a difference? A cyclic regimen of HRT involves taking HRT in a manner that does create a cycle, in the sense that it builds up the lining inside your uterus and then causes it to shed. But in the context of taking HRT for menopause, this happens after your ovaries have gone out of business. By the time you take HRT, your ovaries are dead. Dead, dead, dead. Small and shriveled and dead with a gravestone sign above them. So even though your uterus responds to cyclic hormones, your ovaries do not. Well, if your increased risk of epithelial ovarian cancer is from high numbers of menstrual cycles that have to do with your ovaries and your ovarian cycle, what's going on in your uterus becomes irrelevant. And the most disturbing thing about the fact that some lists of risk factors include HRT as a possibility is the opposing fact that hormonal birth control, containing both estrogen and progestin, significantly decreases your risk for epithelial ovarian cancer. In fact, estrogen plus progestin birth control inhibits the cycles of your ovaries altogether and lowers your menstrual life. Of all the measures for preventing epithelial ovarian cancer short of removing your ovaries, estrogen plus progestin birth control is by far the most effective. So the longer you take estrogen plus progestin birth control, the more you lower your risk for epithelial ovarian cancer. This is one of those pearls of wisdom that most women never learn because they're too busy listening to their ignorant girlfriends who tell them that estrogen plus progestin birth control is dangerous or unnatural. But all studies agree that you decrease your risk of epithelial ovarian cancer by 20% for every 5 years of estrogen plus progestin birth control use. And that adds up to a lot. Here you see a graph that depicts the degree to which you decrease your risk of epithelial ovarian cancer according to how long you took estrogen plus progestin birth control. Along the horizontal x-axis, I've listed time in increments of 5 years. I've included time frames from 5 to 45 years because 45 years is about the longest you could take birth control. That would entail starting at age 10 and taking it until age 55. Along the vertical y-axis, I've listed the percentage risk of epithelial ovarian cancer. The average risk is not high, it's only 1.4%, but not all women have average risk. So on this graph, the 100% risk refers to whatever your personal starting risk is based on all your risk factors. And you see that regardless of your actual risk, your risk decreases by 20% for every 5 years of taking estrogen plus progestin birth control. So if you never take estrogen plus progestin birth control, your risk remains at 100% of whatever your personal risk happens to be. Taking it for 5 years reduces your risk to 80% of that. 10 years reduces it to 64% of that. 15 years to 51% of that. 20 years to 41% of that. 25 years to 33% of that. 30 years to 26% of that. 35 years to 21% of that. 40 years to 17% of that, and 45 years to 14% of that. I am pretty sure that the old woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children she didn't know what to do did not use birth control. But she accomplished the same goal of decreasing her risk of epithelial ovarian cancer by having all those kids. Now, I've taught you that estrogen plus progestin birth control contains much higher hormone dosages than estrogen and progestin in HRT. HRT contains estrogen dosages ranging from 2.5 to 10 micrograms. It's like just drops of estrogen. Whereas birth control contains estrogen dosages ranging from 10 micrograms to 35 micrograms. So it's like a glass full of estrogen. So how can the higher dosage birth control decrease your risk so profoundly and the lower dosage HRT increase it? How can this decrease risk and this increased risk? Does that make any sense to you? Do you see how applying logic pokes holes in listing HRT as a risk factor for epithelial ovarian cancer? My theory is that it's the increased age of women who take HRT and not the HRT itself that increases risk. You've already learned that your risk increases with age. If the hormones themselves increased your risk, you would see this effect with both HRT and birth control. The fact that you do not see any increased risk with estrogen plus progesterone birth control and actually see a lower and lower risk the longer you use birth control really discredits this whole thing. However, there is one study which claims that women taking HRT have a higher risk of epithelial ovarian cancer than women not taking HRT. But, and it's a big, big but, it claims that the risk is only higher while you are taking HRT, and that once you stop taking HRT, the risk goes back to average. Now, this is one of those things I've brought up in previous videos. This should make you scratch your head and say, that just doesn't make any sense. And the reason it doesn't make any sense is more than one. First, the study lasted only 5.5 years. And you know that it takes much longer than that for cancers to develop if the HRT actually causes them. Second, if the HRT does cause them while you are taking it, the cancer's not going to disappear when you stop taking it. By definition, cancers grow out of control and just keep growing and spreading. Once they've gotten started, withdrawing the causative agent does not make the cancer disappear. Third, There are no other studies showing this increased risk of epithelial ovarian cancer with HRT. Never rely on just one study. So the question mark after HRT is a big, big question mark. And most lists of risk factors do not include HRT as a risk factor. So the summary boils down to something really, really simple. The higher the number of menstrual cycles you have in your lifetime, the higher your risk of epithelial ovarian cancer. Or I guess you could say that the reproductive risk factors for epithelial ovarian cancer are a reproduction of the reproductive risk factors for breast cancer. If you learn the reproductive risk factors for one, you know the reproductive risk factors for the other. Ironically, this is somewhat like reproduction and child rearing itself, don't you think? I mean, once you get pregnant the first time, you're likely to get pregnant a second time, and that's reproduction. But once you have one child, you don't really have to do much that differently in terms of child rearing, because regardless of whether you have one child or more than one child, what you do for one kind of serves the others. And if you're child-free, you're less likely to be cancer-free. So the reproductive risk factors for breast cancer are also the reproductive risk factors for epithelial ovarian cancer. I just love it when a bunch of details all boil down to the same thing. And I love digging into the nitty-gritty details to discover why. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not. This time it was really easy, partly because the associations are obvious, and partly because you already saw this same phenomenon in the breast cancer unit. It will be interesting to see whether or not other things like lifestyle factors are consistent between breast cancer and epithelial ovarian cancer. And we'll tap into that next week. I would just love it if you scheduled a consultation with me at menopausetailor.me so that I can meet you and help you manage your menopause your way. I'll also love it if you subscribe right here to both my newsletter and my channel. And you'll love it if you follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. And I will love seeing you again in a week. Bye for now.